Among the most highly anticipated decisions in the Fulton County, Georgia trial was whether Trump's former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, would be successful in his bid to remove the case from state court to federal court. We finally have an answer to that question. A federal district court judge has rejected this effort by Mark Meadows, meaning this case will remain in state court. Why is this important? Because if Meadows was successful, it would inform Trump's attempts to also have this case removed to federal court. Remember, just this week, Trump filed a motion in court stating that he may seek removal to federal court, which, by the way, doesn't actually mean anything. You either file a motion to remove the case or not, but it did signal that this is at least on Trump's radar, even if he was just doing it for PR purposes. But what's certainly clear is that whatever happened with Mark Meadows would play a big role with how he proceeded with his own efforts to remove this case from Fulton County. In terms of why Meadows' effort was rejected, the judge, Steve Jones, an Obama appointee, wrote, "The court concludes that Meadows has not shown that the actions that triggered the state's prosecution related to his federal office. Meadows' participation on the January 2nd, 2021 call was political in nature and involved the president's private litigation, neither of which are related to the scope of the office of the White House Chief of Staff. The court finds that these contributions to the phone call with Secretary of Raffensperger went beyond those activities that are within the official role of the White House Chief of Staff, such as scheduling the president's phone calls, observing meetings, and attempting to wrap up meetings in order to keep the president on schedule." In other words, Meadows had been claiming that because he was acting on Trump's orders and because Donald Trump was a federal official, that he had grounds to remove this case to federal court because this would ostensibly become a federal issue. But Judge Jones rejected these attempts because, while Trump was a federal official, his acts fell outside the scope of what his duties as president were. What with overturning an election not exactly within the confines of a president and his cabinet's job descriptions. In fact, Judge Jones also invoked the Hatch Act to explain exactly how Meadows' activities fell outside the scope of his official duties. He wrote, "Statutorily, the Hatch Act is helpful in defining the outer limits of the scope of White House Chief of Staff's authority. The state argues, and Meadows agrees, that he is bound by the Hatch Act, a law that prohibits federal employees from engaging in political activity. While the court does not rely on the merits of a Hatch Act violation, it does recognize that the Hatch Act provides that political activity is not included in the outer limits of the role of the White House Chief of Staff. The Hatch Act prohibits executive branch employees from using their official authority or influence for the purpose of interfering with or affecting the results of an election. The federal regulation governing political activities of federal employees prohibits the same. The regulation broadly defines political activity to be activity directed toward the success or failure of a political party, candidate for partisan political office, or partisan political group. The types of behaviors that Meadows is alleged to be involved in include post-election activities and election outcomes in various states pertaining to a particular candidate for office." So unless Mark Meadows was unfamiliar with perhaps the most well-known act in government, then he has no excuse when it comes to violating that act in service of helping his boss overturn an election. Now, I should point out that just because Meadows' case wasn't removed to the federal court system, while it certainly doesn't help Trump's efforts, it also doesn't preclude him from being able to have his own case removed. Again, this decision by the judge probably doesn't inspire a lot of confidence for Trump, but it also doesn't guarantee that his own efforts will be doomed. And as I mentioned at the top, Trump has already signaled his intent to try his hand at removal in the coming days or weeks. It is important to note one point with regard to removal, and that is this question of pardons. On its face, it would seem that by virtue of removing this case from the state court system, where if Trump won in 2024, he wouldn't be able to pardon himself, to the federal court system, he perhaps would have a better chance of being able to pardon himself then. That's not exactly the case. I spoke with former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirshner in our latest episode of The Legal Breakdown about exactly that point, and this is what he had to say. If Trump is successful at removing this to the federal court system, would he then be able to pardon himself if he wins the presidency in 2024?
Yeah, always worth talking about, because when we talk about state court prosecutions, we know that a presidential pardon, a federal pardon, does not apply to state court convictions. When we talk about federal court convictions, presidential pardons do apply. A president can pardon somebody for a federal court conviction. So it kind of feels like if the case gets transferred from state court to federal court, well, then couldn't you use a presidential pardon? And the answer is no, because even though this is a little counterintuitive, if the case gets transferred, it's still a state court case. It is still brought in violation of Georgia state law. It is still prosecuted by Georgia state prosecutors. It just so happens that the forum, the court in which the case is tried, is a federal court, but it remains a state case, and a president cannot pardon somebody who is convicted after having their case removed from state court to federal court.
So what's the point of removing it to the federal court system if Donald Trump wouldn't be able to pardon himself, which, by the way, we don't even know if he'd be able to do, but that notwithstanding, is this just to get away from a Fulton County jury?
I think that's the primary reason and the primary potential benefit to Donald Trump. You know, Donald Trump might think that he'll get a little bit more play with a federal court judge than he would with a Georgia state court judge. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that the federal judge who's handling at least Mark Meadows' removal hearing, and presumably he would be presiding over the case in the event Mark Meadows and Donald Trump's cases get removed to federal court, is an Obama appointee. Now, you know what? He's a straight up judge. He's a respected jurist. But in this day and age, we are forever, talking about which president appointed which federal court judge.
And of course, to see more episodes of The Legal Breakdown, make sure to subscribe to this channel to stay on top of legal news as soon as it breaks. But the point here is that whether Meadows or Trump, this is all the result of their desperation to find a judge and a jury who are loyal to them. So when you wonder why Trump seems so intent on trying this case in the court of public opinion, this is why. He's out there day in and day out tainting the jury pool. His sole objective is to portray himself as the victim in all of this on a constant basis in the hopes that he's able to convince one person who ultimately ends up in the jury that he's being unfairly prosecuted. Of course, his odds of tainting the jury are much higher in a jurisdiction that perhaps isn't as blue as Fulton County, which is why he's not only running this PR campaign out there, but he's also simultaneously trying to get this thing out of Fulton County, Georgia. Trump and his acolytes have one move here: to avoid accountability by any means necessary. Their removal attempt is just the latest in a seemingly endless string of unapologetic efforts to get away with their crimes scot-free. So at this point, Meadows will certainly appeal, because why wouldn't he seek to delay and impede this trial every single step of the way? And of course, Trump too will attempt the same thing, even though the precedent being set with the Meadows decision doesn't exactly bode well for Trump's efforts. If Meadows wasn't acting within the scope of his duties while aiding Trump in trying to overturn an election, then I wouldn't exactly expect Trump's efforts himself in trying to overturn that election to succeed as far as removal goes. But if it buys him more time to whine and complain and cast himself as the victim, then you can bet your last dollar that that's exactly what he's going to do. Because at the end of the day, this is only about one thing: trying to evade accountability for his own actions. And so far, it doesn't seem like it's working out too well. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help grow the progressive media ecosystem. I don't do sponsorships or paid ads, I won't ask for money, but just subscribing to this channel goes a really long way, and it helps get the message out to more people. The subscribe button is right here on the screen. You can also subscribe to my Spanish language channel, which I made to reach those crucial Spanish-speaking voters. That link is on the screen too. And finally, if you want to listen to my audio podcast, you can follow that link as well. Thanks so much for watching.